This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. Your Excellency, the Honourable Francis Adamson AC, Governor of South Australia, Mr Rod Bunton, federal and state members who are in attendance tonight, Professor David Lloyd, Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of South Australia, the Honourable Sir Eric Neal, AC, CVO, FTSE, former Governor of South Australia, former Commissioner of Sydney and former Chancellor of Flinders University and a very long-time friend of UniSA, Nobel Laureate Professor Peter Doherty AC, tonight's Speaker, the Right Honourable the Lord Mayor of Adelaide, Sandy Verschoor, Mr Greg Mitchell, Emeritus Professor Hugh White AO and Mrs Jane White, Ms Blanche de Pulgey, widow of Bob Hawke, after whom we named the Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre and thus this evening's lecture, Ms Jill Saunders, Fellow of the University, and Uncle Lewis Yalaburka O'Brien, AO, Senior Ghana Elders. Welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us this evening for what I know is going to be a very fascinating evening. But before we begin, I would like to invite Uncle Lewis to the stage to welcome us all to Ghana country.
Marawajanga, Ghana Mian and Iwangani, Mani de Budni Ghani Atana, Naibiriko, Mankalakala, Tandanya, Mianaku, Nature Yungandalia, Nature Yakanandalia, Padniadlu Wadu. On behalf of the Ghana people, I welcome you all to Ghana country, and I do this ambassador of the Adelaide Plains people. My brothers, my sisters, let's walk together in harmony. A bloke was expecting his wife to have a baby, so he rang up the hospital and he said, "Has my wife had the baby yet?" And she said, "Is this her firstborn?" "No, you idiot, this is her husband."
Thank you, Uncle Lewis. Your welcome always leaves a great impression on us, and we know that your people have been custodians of this land for some 65,000 years. And while we struggle with the demands and challenges of the 21st century, it's good to know that our First Nations people have seen it all before. Of course, one of the greatest challenges the world has faced in the 21st century has been COVID-19. For the past 2 years, as the world ground to a halt as people grappled with the disease, an international band of experts literally dropped everything to concentrate on COVID-19 and finding a way to stop its devastation. Professor Peter Doherty AC, immunologist, pathologist, author and patron of the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity in Melbourne, was one such expert. In 1996, he shared the Nobel Prize in Medicine for discovering the nature of cellular immune defence. And incidentally, one of the 6 books that he has published for general readership is The Beginner's Guide to Winning the Nobel Prize. So that's definitely worth a read if your goal is to join the elite group of men and women who, according to the Nobel Committee, during the preceding year have conferred the greatest benefit to mankind. In his recent book, An Insider's Plague Year, which incidentally you can purchase here tonight, Professor Doherty tells us that while citizens and governments around the world face the disaster with varying degrees of competence, the world's scientists stepped up. He provides a deep understanding of the virus and of the numerous areas of knowledge that have been brought together in the fight against it. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Doherty AC as he gives a snapshot of how health experts and governments worked to control the challenge of COVID-19 and what awaits us in the months and years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Your Excellency, distinguished guests, colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen. It's always a great pleasure to be in Adelaide. I think first time I spoke at this venue was the year after the Nobel Prize, 1997, when I was Australian of the Year. I was living in Memphis, Tennessee at the time. They had a somewhat different mechanism for selecting the Australian of the Year. Few people sat around in Sydney with a couple of bottles of Grange, and if someone sort of popped up and they could get it over with quickly, they made them the Australian of the Year. So I just won the Nobel Prize. That was obviously a target, and they called me up on Christmas Eve. And after you've won the Nobel Prize, you have a very busy year the next year. And I said, could I put it off for a year? And they said, no way if you ever want to come back here. So I did it. And it was great, actually, because I'd been living in the States then for 8 years, and it reintroduced me to Australia and allowed me to meet a number of wonderful Australians. And I've just had that confirmed that there are a lot of wonderful Australians. The last election showed us. I've been on Twitter a lot over the last year. I've got more Twitter followers than any Nobel Prize winner ever has. That's no great distinction. I'm not a Kardashian or something, but I've got more than Brian Schmidt, and he's a physicist, and physicists are much smarter than biologists, they'll tell you that. And he's Vice Chancellor of ANU, but I've got more than he has. But the reason I got a lot of Twitter, you know, I'm not going to give the lecture that I wrote out. This lecture has been put off twice. It was supposed to be given in 2021. So I wrote a very intelligent, very pointed lecture, basically an experimentalist view of policy, which was basically designed to target the then government and point out what a bunch of dickheads they were. And of course, that lecture no longer travels well. So I've changed a bit of the wording, and they're going to circulate it. So you can get to read it, for what it's worth. You know, an experimental scientist commenting on policy. Can you think of anything more ridiculous? I mean, the nature of experimental science is we design a little controlled universe. That's why you've got so many anal retentives in the scientific community. And we make the rules, and then we do experiments within those rules. Nothing can be more alien to public administration or public policy, obviously. I mean, Winston Churchill had it absolutely right. Scientists should be always on tap and never on top. So my suggestions about public policy are probably not all that useful. Maybe we'll get to some of them eventually, but I got my eye on the clock, and if I run out of time, we'll get to those things. Yeah, Twitter's interesting because I was tweeting a lot about how I was on Twitter because my publishers had me on Twitter, and this is supposed to be part of a book tour. That's what I thought it was when I accepted the invitation. I didn't realise I'd have to write out a speech. I never do that. But I had to, of course, because it's Bob Hawke. I mean, the legacy of Bob Hawke is such that if you're doing something in his name, you have to do something. So I wrote it out. And it will be inflicted on you at some stage if you care to actually waste time reading it. So on Twitter's very interesting. What I was doing there was trying to get people to be vaccinated and trying to explain the infection. That infectious disease is an enormously complicated area of science. And I've been working on it for 55 years, and by goodness, this virus has me very confused. And it's got us all confused, actually. It's extremely an unusual pathogen. We haven't experienced anything quite like it. But on Twitter, I'm trying to explain what infections are about. Viruses can only live in living cells. You can't treat them with antibiotics because they're not separate cells, and you have to target specific mechanisms and what the virus does and all the rest of it. And I'll say a bit about COVID and how it works and all that. And of course, talking about vaccination, I'm getting these virulent attacks back because I'm accused of working for Pfizer, for Bill Gates, and the Chinese Communist Party all at the same time, which is really a pretty big achievement on my part, I think. And then, of course, being an undisciplined personality and not regarding Twitter as part of my official job description, I felt I could be totally irresponsible. So as soon as Trump came along, of course, I was trying to do what I could to discredit this horror of a man. And that led to some stuff that from Americans that I'm very glad I'm actually not living in the United States, because some fairly nasty threats came across. And so Twitter has been interesting. I might, if I run out of steam, I'll talk about it a bit more. So Adelaide, of course, is a great city and always a wonderful audience, because the people that come out to a lecture in Adelaide are an interesting group. And you know, being an academic and of a certain type, I tend at times to make provocative statements to see what will come back. You know, we do that. Very much in the British academic culture. It's sort of the Oxbridge high table. Now, unfortunately, if you're living in Oxbridge and you get into that high table culture, you can spend your whole life being clever with other academics around the high table and never actually do anything, which is why most serious scientists avoid it. But it can make kind of fun. Americans don't get this. I mean, they think you're insulting them. But if I insult you, it's just I'm trying to get something back. So, but Adelaide is interesting, and you know, with respect to that sort of making provocative statements, which will only be to stop you going to sleep because it's getting later in the day. The greatest title I've ever seen for a book. It's an autobiography by a man called Max Perutz. Max was a Viennese who escaped Nazi Germany, or escaped from Nazi Europe before the Anschluss, and came across to Britain and became a very famous scientist, an X-ray crystallographer. He won the 1962 Nobel Prize, the same year as Watson and Crick got the Nobel Prize for working out the structure of DNA, building a model. And he was a charming man, and very a man who worked with young people a lot, and really an excellent man. And but he wrote his autobiography later in his life, and the autobiography has the most wonderful title. It's "I Wish I Had Made You Angry Earlier," and I think that's really great. Now, being an X-ray crystallographer, Perutz was in the lineage of Adelaide's own Braggs. William and Lawrence Bragg. You know, William Bragg was professor of physics. He wasn't from Adelaide, but he came in to be professor of physics at the University of Adelaide. His son Lawrence grew up here, went to St. Peter's School in Adelaide. And then when they went back to Britain, they actually put together the story that won the 1915 Nobel Prize. Lawrence Bragg is still, I think, the youngest at age 25 to win a Nobel Prize in the Sciences. And it is the case that St. Peter's School in Adelaide has the Australian record for Nobel Prize winners. It has Lawrence Bragg, Howard Florey, and Robin Warren, who won the Nobel Prize with Helicobacter and shared it in Western Australia. So, no, what's that got to do with anything? Good, okay. So what we've lived through over the last 2 years are two really major tectonic shifts, and one is COVID-19. I've written about pandemics. I wrote a book about pandemics back in 2013. I don't think I ever actually expected to live through one. And the other one, of course, is the change in Australian politics, which is, I think, going to be a change for quite a long time because of the rise of the independents and the changing demographics of our country. It's been wonderful for many of us. I no longer have to hover, if I'm watching the television news, hover with my finger over the mute button, and I find that encouraging. And when the leader of the opposition comes on, I don't feel the need for that at all. I just find it vastly amusing. And he's wonderfully entertaining, isn't he? I think I'm looking forward to the next couple of years. Yeah. I've covered that, so I'm going to say that again. So my professional expertise is in infection and immunity. I'm a pathologist. I'm interested in the way diseases work. I'm interested in. It's called pathogenesis, how a disease develops. And an immunologist, we won the Nobel Prize, my colleague Rolf Zickernagel and I won it from experiments we did with viruses that told us we made a big breakthrough. We were very, very, very lucky. That's basically the main element of advice in the book, of The Beginner's Guide to Winning the Nobel Prize. Get very, very lucky. I mean, it's a very useful book. Don't buy it for anyone. And the other thing, though, I've gotten more and more involved in over the last, since the Nobel Prize, and since I started to take a role in public science communication, and I've written books and done all sorts of stuff, but the other thing I really got involved in is climate change, because it is such a massive, massive problem for us. And people say, well, you're not a climate scientist, you're a climate scientist. They're all physicists and oceanographers and marine biologists on the Barrier Reef and all that stuff, really smart people. But basically, what climate change is about for all of us is about biology. What it's going to do to biological systems, what it's going to do to complex life forms. We all species, animals, plants, live within some sort of climate envelope. I mean, there are some bacteria that can live in boiling water, but that's not true for most of us. And of course, prominently from Adelaide, there was a very prominent science skeptic who was actually a geologist. And he's right, you know, the rocks are going to be fine. I mean, we don't worry about the rock. So let's talk about COVID-19. So COVID-19 started in Wuhan in about 2019, December 2019. And I think, actually, the Chinese have been pretty straightforward about what was happening. They got it wrong initially, being an authoritarian state. There were a group of young physicians who were circulating emails saying, we're seeing a bad respiratory infection that looks like SARS, the one that hit in 2001, 2002. And these guys were all arrested by the local cops. And, you know, that's the problem. With any authoritarian system, it always gets down to idiots. And so they put these guys in jail. But then, of course, there was a real problem. The virus hit. The virologists started to go on top of it. I don't think there was anything really happening in Wuhan before that. One of our scientists, Danielle Anderson, was actually in the lab at that time. If there'd been anything going on, I think she would have heard about it. And there was a meeting in January, in December, where actually those scientists came to Singapore, and there was no discussion there either. So I don't think anything was going on that was weird. So the virus hit in Wuhan. So we all heard about it pretty quickly. The Chinese, pushed a bit by Eddie Holmes, who's in Sydney, won the 2021 Prime Minister's Prize, and is an expert on virus evolution and virus sequences. He does a lot of looks at gene sequences and stuff, and was working very closely with these people. All these people are pretty satisfied, the people who actually know about it, that this virus came out of nature. It came probably out of bats, probably through what was called the Wuhan seafood market, where it jumped across into another species. We don't really know what. The pangolin was suggested, but that's not really clear, and then probably jumped across into us. That's what happened with the original SARS virus. There's a movie about it, Contagion. You may have seen it. It was called, it's described as a thinking man's horror movie. So Thinking Man meant it didn't do very well at the box office, but and we saw Gwyneth Paltrow had the top of her head taken off. Not the real Gwyneth, actually, but she spread it all over the place and died. So, you know, a very entertaining movie. And but it basically was the same scene. I mean, the bat infected a pig, the pig infected a chef, and the chef handled some meat and so forth, and Gwyneth came to meet the chef, and she got it, and then she took it back to the States. Anyone who looked at this woman caught this bloody virus, much more infectious than COVID, and lots of people died. And then they developed a vaccine, and the next day everyone got vaccinated, just like with COVID, you remember, and everyone's just fine. Well, you know, so initially we were saying, well, COVID, it's not influenza. But the actual scientific community was thinking it's not influenza, but it's probably like influenza in the way it works. And we were why were they saying it's not influenza? Well, the imaging guys, the guys who sort of peer into your chest, were saying that what we call ground glass consolidations in the lung. Well, you know, think about it. You don't want ground glass consolidations in an organ which is designed with very, very delicate cells to exchange oxygen between red blood cells in the atmosphere, pushing out carbon dioxide, pulling in oxygen. So ground glass is bad. But fortunately, those tend to repair, so it's not too terrible. And so we thought, you know, it's not true, but it's like flu. So all the thinking was based on that. The word was in the flu community, you can't stop influenza by stopping the planes. Well, in actual fact, we did stop influenza by stopping the planes. But this was the mantra out there. And basically, what would have stopped COVID, of course, is if we had stopped the planes right at the beginning. Now China stopped the internal flights out of Wuhan, but it didn't stop the international ones. So one good thing that our previous government did was listen to the scientists and shut down that travel very quickly. And that was, you know, our government did pretty well with the national cabinet, and so with the first year or so of this, they really did pretty well. It kind of fragmented later when people started to play politics again, and then, of course, now we have the current situation. But so we were thinking it's kind of like flu. But then we found, and it was a pathologist in New York who found it, that actually the problem with gas exchange in the lung, with flu, the problem is your lung fills up with fluid, tends to fill with fluid, and you basically drown. I hope I'm entertaining you. Flu is a bad disease, and it is out there now, and it's picking up in numbers in Melbourne very quickly, in fact. So if you haven't had the flu vaccine, get it. But what this pathologist found is when she looked at the little blood vessels in the lung, those very delicate blood vessels where the gas exchange occurred, there were tiny clots, micro clots. This is a clotting disease. And what was stopping the gas exchange was as much as the damage to the lung itself with these little microclots. So, and it's what's called a coagulopathy. It's a thromboembolic disease, which is why you can get strokes and things from it as well. It's not one of the most common side effects, but it can happen. And then the other thing that makes it different from influenza is this virus gets into the blood and goes around the body in the blood. And of course, once something's in the blood, it's everywhere. And so we're getting infection in the heart, or we're getting infection in the kidneys. And that explained a lot of what was going on. The fact that diabetics were particularly susceptible, because diabetes doesn't help your kidneys and so forth. And so it's what we call a systemic infection, which influenza in humans normally is not. It does not get around the body and the blood. And it's complicated. The other thing, I'm not a virologist, but we all thought, even though we knew this virus can mutate and change, we thought it would mutate and change less than influenza because it's got some sort of proofreading mechanism. But that's not really been the case, and it actually is changing a lot. What we're seeing, I think, what we saw is with those variants that were coming along with alpha, beta, and then delta, the virus was actually changing in ways that meant that it grew better. And if it grew better, it transmitted more. Viruses are very simple. All they want to do is get into our cells. They have to get into our cells to infect. They have to infect our cells to multiply because they take over our cells, turn them into virus-producing factories. So they have to get into our cells, and that's where the antibodies that are floating around in the blood that we immunise with vaccination kind of stop them. And they grab hold of the virus and stop it binding to the surface receptor on the cell and getting into the cell in the first place. So that's what we call antibody neutralisation. That's the primary line of defence that's used by that results from most vaccines. But all the viruses want to, it doesn't want anything, it's just a tiny bit of nucleic acid, but it's to get into cells, multiply, and then spread to other individuals. And that's, of course, what it does. So what those variants like beta and then delta were doing was actually multiplying better than the previous variant and infecting more people, so they took over. But what we've been seeing now with Omicron is a virus which is highly infectious, came along after Delta, is more changed as far as the immune response, and that means the antibodies generated by the vaccine are concerned, and is much less well neutralised by those vaccine-induced antibodies. With Omicron, and what we're seeing now, you'll hear about BA1 and BA2, and now we're getting BA4 and BA5. These are mutant versions of that strain. The previous ones weren't mutant versions of each other, they were separate lineages that were coming out. But this is a mutant version. And what that probably means, I think, is these are what we call immune escape variants. So the vaccines, everyone is being encouraged to get a third or fourth shot of vaccine. The third shot of vaccine, much to our surprise, is bringing up some antibodies against these Omicron strains. That's really surprising because we're giving 3 shots of the same vaccine at intervals, and it's bringing up these rare antibodies, and the 4th shot is boosting it up even higher. So we think there's protection there. We think it's still helping to keep people out of hospital, but of course the virus, particularly in the frail elderly, the virus is going through it. But what has been added to the repertoire when it comes to actually dealing with it from the part of the physicians is we now have an antiviral, at least one very good antiviral drug called Paxlovid. And this has to be taken pretty much immediately after infection. So if anyone gets infected, at the moment it's limited in access to people who are over 65 and have 2 other comorbidities, serious issues, or they've got some major immunosuppressive issue, or over 75 and have other comorbidity. But if you're in that catalogue, make sure that when you do get it, you notify the authorities, you notify your GP, because it's possible you can get that drug, Paxlovid, which could have a really big effect, because if it's given early, day 1, it will stop the virus growing. In some people, the virus then blips up a bit later on, but it's not as bad when it does come up, and it goes down pretty quickly. So that's where we are with the actual treatment of it. Now, early on, we had no real, we didn't know how to deal with this. And what transpired is some fairly simple and very available drugs could be used to help people a lot. And one of those was heparin at low dose to stop people clotting. So that was really important, because this can be a clotting disease, can be part of it. And the other thing is a drug called dexamethasone, an anti-inflammatory, very old drug, very cheap, that actually helped people a lot by reducing the amount of cells and the damage that's done by cells flooding into the lung and trying to cure the infection. So treatment got better. It's very interesting. There's just been a series published from China, from those very early patients, looking at the long-term sequelae from that. That's the other thing, of course, you will have heard about long COVID. I've just been reviewing this. I've been trying to get on top of it. Through the pandemic, I've been writing a weekly essay for our website. They're called Setting It Straight. The book, The Insider's Plague Year, has the first 42 of those essays, which explain a lot of the basic science. But now I've now written number 108, so it's sort of gone a bit further than that. And the book's useful in the fact that it has that basic explanatory stuff in it. But I'm writing about long COVID. Very confusing. It's mainly self-reported, and that's great. And it's actually the patients themselves who actually first identified this problem being infected and maybe not even having a severe infection or even very mild to an apparent, and then getting a disease that starts to develop after a month or two and becomes progressively more debilitating, at least for a time, though people tend to come out of that. Now looking at the literature, I'm starting to see from what's being published that part of what's being described as long COVID is what we would think of as the effects of being in hospital and being very sick and being on ICU unit and so forth. That is associated with real damage. That may never repair. And we know that from influenza, from a lot of other diseases, the post-ICU syndrome. So part of that is being called long COVID, and then you have this other type of part where it can develop from a very mild infection. And vaccination is giving some protection against that happening, but it's not great. And it's also reducing some of the symptomatology. So we really don't know the long-term consequences of COVID. And quite frankly, I can't tell you where it's going. We're hoping that this Omicron experience is going to get us to a stage where a relatively mild virus is circulating, or most people are immune, and it will also all quieten down. But we can't guarantee it, and we don't know that another more virulent strain will not come along. It will come to an end, but when exactly is not all that clear. The other thing about this, I think, as an experimentalist, is that different countries have done different types of public health experiments, and the extent to which they protected their populations against some of these early strains and how they handled those economic situations. We did a very good experiment here for a time, and I think it's going to be important to actually look at those experiments and try to learn what we can from them. We need not just scientists looking at them, sociologists, economists, everyone actually with those insights into so that we may develop a better perspective on what to actually do if this happens again. Now, will it happen again? Well, it's not too encouraging to look at what we do know. What we do know is that prior to the year 2000, there were 2 coronaviruses circulating in the human population. We'd known about those since the 1960s, since they were first described in Britain and the USA. And they were called common cold coronaviruses, human coronaviruses. So they've been circulating. We'd never taken that much notice of them. There were very few people working on them because they didn't cause particularly severe problems on the whole, though we do wonder, with what we've seen with COVID, whether we weren't missing some things, particularly in terms of long-term sequelae. But since 2000, there have been 5 more human coronaviruses circulating. The first was the SARS-CoV-1 in 2002. Then 2 more common cold ones were found in 2004. One of them may have been circulating earlier and we may have missed it. Then there's one called the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syncytial Virus, MERS, which is a virus that goes from bats to camels to people. Never kiss a camel. I mean, people do kiss camels. It's also never kiss a pig either, because the influenza virologists always used to show this picture of this little kid kissing a pig. And flu viruses go backwards and forwards between us and pigs. My epidemiologist colleague, Jodie McVernon, who's actually the Doherty modelling that you read about. That's nothing to do with me. I'm not smart enough to be a modeller. But Jodie runs that operation. So Jodie, looking at this, she's a paediatrician. Most people say, well, you know, that kid can catch flu from the pig. Well, Jodie says that little bugger's giving flu to the pig. Well, she's a woman with great insight. And so why has this suddenly come up? Well, I think what's happening may be embedded in Asian culture, and that culture of getting wild animals and killing them to eat for food, partly as a food source, also of consuming live production chickens. They like to buy live birds and kill them, and the live animal bird markets. These are not a problem with coronaviruses, but that's where there's a real risk with influenza, which is basically an avian virus that jumps into us. And so we've had to watch those live bird markets very closely with the flus. But I think what's happening is that cultural model, which can lead to these transmissions, there is now a risk of global spread. And that's because of the increased prosperity in Asia and the fact that many people are getting on passenger planes and flying around the planet. So what we will really need in the long term, I think, is to have agreement across the planet that when something like this comes up, everybody is being completely open I think we stop the planes. The other thing that's being pushed very strongly, we've seen vaccines helped, and they helped a lot, and they probably saved a lot of lives. But we've also seen the limits of vaccination with this virus. And I think what we need is to look at the strategy we use with AIDS. AIDS, we've never made a vaccine. It's a tremendously difficult problem because the virus copies back into our genome and we can never get rid of it. So we probably won't get a vaccine, though there are still some strategies, unless some major new technology breakthrough comes along, which is always possible. But the way we handle AIDS is people take drugs all the time. They take cocktails of at least 2 drugs, maybe 3, and that keeps them well, and they live pretty reasonable lives. And so what I think we need to think about, and this is being pushed very much by Tony Fauci at National Institutes of Health, who's been enormously effective in this, is to develop a panel of drugs against all those viruses that are likely to jump into us. We have some of them for influenza, but we need more and better ones. And we have one very good one for COVID, but we need more because you don't want to use just one drug because what you'll do is get a mutation and escape. This is the basic principle of cancer therapy, for instance. You don't just use one drug. And I think if we had those cocktails of drugs that we could deploy quickly, I sort of envisage we'd have something like the sort of SAS or something ready to parachute into places with boxes of drugs ready to give to people. We need a global mechanism. We need global coordination, which is one of the reasons the kind of idiocy that's going on in the Ukraine and the muscling up in the Pacific is so insane. We've got real problems out there. We don't need this stuff. And the other one, of course, is climate change that is inexorable, and unlike COVID, we're not going to bring it to an end with a drug or a vaccine. I think climate change is unacceptable to a lot of people. I mean, people talk about it as a war that has to be won. But the thing is with climate change, if we won, it's still going on. It's progressive. There's no peace treaty. You can't bomb it or shoot it or torpedo it. That's what makes it very unacceptable to elements on the right. I mean, they always want a bad guy that you can shoot or bomb or torpedo. But actually, especially with climate change, the bad guys are us, actually. That's pretty unfortunate. And with viruses, that gets them very upset. The idea of bad bugs as distinct from bad people, that's why we had all this stuff. Bad people are making these viruses. They're sending them around the planet to kill us all. Absolute crap. I mean, our Prime Minister, fortunately late Prime Minister, bought into it. So basically, climate change, I think, is really, in a way, it's a more serious problem. I don't think we're going to be wiped out by a pandemic. We're certainly not going to be wiped out by this one. And I don't think we'd be wiped out by something more severe. Something that's much more severe than COVID creates a much more rigid and rapid response than, for instance, Ebola. Ebola is a terrible disease, a much worse disease. But we don't worry about an Ebola pandemic, even though it's very infectious if you touch people who are suffering with Ebola, because people react so strongly and so quickly. So, climate change. Well, I don't know whether you picked up on it, but last year's Nobel Prize for Physics was for climate change modelling. And so the guys at the Swedish Academy, which awards the Nobel Prize, sort of gave us a complete rundown on the history of climate change modelling. It's the second Nobel Prize for climate change. The other was a Peace Prize that went to Al Gore and the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. Now, so they went through a bit of the history of modelling in presenting the prize. It was won by Sakura Manabe, who's a Japanese who worked at Princeton University, Klaus Hasselmann, who works in Germany, and Giorgio Parisi, who won it for something a little bit different, who works in Rome. And basically, the history of it is that the sort of first sense that something might be a problem here goes back to about 1824, and a man called Joseph Fourier described what he called dark heat, We now call it infrared. And then a bit later, in the 1850s, a man called John Tyndall, an Englishman, came along and said, well, you know, he explained how shortwave light would convert into heat. We now know shortwave radiation comes through the atmosphere quite readily, hits the Earth and as light, and then it becomes heat, long-wave radiation, which can't escape out again. And then in the 1890s, a guy called Svante Arrhenius started to make the connection with greenhouse gases and made some of the first climate change models. This is all happening at about the same time we're seeing the science of infectious disease start to emerge. You may think we've known about infectious disease forever. We go back to the plague of the Middle Ages and so forth. But in fact, we only really started to understand infectious disease in the 19th century. The first really major study was done by John Snow, who showed that cholera was spreading from a water pump. They shut down the water pump in London, they shut down the cholera. Then Semmelweis in Hungary said that obstetricians, I don't think they called them that at that stage, should wash their hands in antiseptic, and then women wouldn't die of puerperal fever. They thought he was crazy and sent you to a mental asylum, but of course he was right. And then we have Pasteur coming along and showing the germ theory of infectious disease in the mid-18th, 19th century. And then Robert Koch showing the tubercle bacillus caused tuberculosis. The first attenuated vaccines were made. We knew about vaccines from Jenner's work and from Vaccinia and so forth, but we didn't ever make a vaccine in the lab. This was a set of observations that were made. And then, so we started to understand the basics of these modern scientific disciplines at much the same time. With the climate change thing, the thing I think our present government will be very aware of is not only the need to deal with it, but the fact that there may be political implications and trade implications. The 2018 Nobel Prize for Economics was shared by William Nordhaus, who wrote about the free rider problem with respect to climate change. And of course, we were kind of firmly in that category until this change in government. And it's good, I think, that we're no longer seen in that light internationally. And basically, when you think about climate change, you realize that this will involve massive change. And I don't think politically it's going to be very easy to face that, but we're going to have to because it would be forced on us. I mean, as Tancredi, the aristocrat in the novel The Leopard, de Lampedusa's novel, says, in order for things to remain the same, everything will have to change. And that's really what we're confronting here with climate change. So the insider, the experimentalist looking at policy. Well, the way we work in biomedical science, for instance, is that before we do anything, we have to get ethical approval. It doesn't matter whether we're working with laboratory animals or we're working with human beings. There are ethics committees that scrutinize very closely everything we can do. Some of you may have served on those ethics committees. They're drawn from the scientific community, from the university sector. They're also drawn from the community. People who do all sorts of jobs, frequently retired school teachers and pastors, may involve themselves in the work of ethics committees. They're enormously important. They only really developed during the course of my career after some really scandalous things were done by the medical establishment that were really, we would not even contemplate now. The other thing about science, which is largely funded from the public sector, basic science, is that sources of funding and conflicts of interest have to be clearly stated in whenever you publish or when you get approval to do the work. It would be interesting to think, in view of what the opposition to the idea of an ICAC, which of course was one of the deciding factors in this last election, how that would apply to politics. If there's no reason that I can see, given modern communication systems, why every politician should not have online a complete source of their funding, where it comes from and where the possible conflicts of interests are. If you watch the operation of the last Parliament, you got the impression at times that the term conflict of interest was absolutely unknown. And beyond that, that the idea of, say, that insider trading was totally unknown too, because it did seem that some people were doing rather well on the stock market out of insights they must have got from the Parliament. I don't think they would be tremendously difficult steps to take in cleaning up the political process. Now, there are many other things that, looking at the way our government works, that seem pretty obvious. I think from the fact that our previous government made some really rather stupid and major mistakes, they wouldn't have done that if they'd had a decent, professional civil service with higher level civil servants who could basically tell them when they're doing something really stupid. I think we need to bring back Sir Humphrey in a big way. And I got this insight from my colleague and friend, Glenn Davis. And I'm enormously happy to know that Glenn will be the new head of Prime Minister and Cabinet. He's an enormously effective person, and he knows what he wants to do, and he will do his utmost to do it. So I think what we may see in this country, I'm sure we will see, is actually a starting to rebuild some of that professional expertise in our public service. I do not think that parliamentary government can work properly without a high-quality professional civil service. Now, you might think, America, do they have that? Look, I've met people in American State Department, absolutely brilliant people. They recruit people to state from areas like linguistics and high-energy physics, really top intellects. Of course, Trump did everything possible to damage it, but I think it was resilient and it still survives. We need that level of expertise. Of course, the politicians have to make the decisions, but if they're not informed, and of course the politician comes in from outside, they come in from various backgrounds, and for them to think or pretend that they are suddenly expert in a whole range of issues is kind of ridiculous. And it was clear, for instance, politicians like Trump hated expertise. You saw him up there with Fauci. He hated Fauci because Fauci was actually trying to tell the truth. And of course, he is no friend to the truth. But so, democracy. I think what we've just seen in Australia is a wonderful experiment in democracy, and it's told us that we have a pretty robust and resilient democracy. I went on Twitter when it happened. I was so delighted, like so many people, and I tweeted basically, we've seen the end of this awful government, and thank you, my fellow citizens. It's great when Australians wake up. And then said, stay awake, Australia. I think it's not wake up, Australia. It's maybe wake up occasionally, Australia, that needs to happen. But when Australians wake up, they actually do a great job. And I think we have transformed the political landscape due to various factors coming together all at one time. It is a major transformation. We didn't have to have a revolution. We haven't had to chop anybody's head off. One of the great scientists who had his head chopped off was Antoine Lavoisier, who was one of the people who sort of defined what oxygen is and what it does. Lavoisier was also, his family were wealthy. There were no grants at that time. His family were wealthy at the time of the French Revolution. They were kind of tax farmers. They collected tax for the king, and they took a cut along the way. Sounds like a sort of model for government. And but basically, if you've got 50 negatively geared properties, you don't have to worry. Nobody's going to cut your head off. But that's what happened to Lavoisier. So democracy works, and it worked very well in our case very recently. The other thing is that I go back to always, and I thought a lot about this over the last few years as I looked at what's happening in the United States, is Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which was 600 words. I mean, he really shortchanged his audience. They were out there on the battlefield of Gettysburg. They were expecting a great long address, and he said 600 words. And the last line of that address resonates because it is that government by the people, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, should not perish from the earth. And I think that is the greatest statement of what democracy should be about. As Winston Churchill said, democracy is a terrible system, but basically it's better than everything else. And I think that just about sums it up. So I've tried to provoke a little, say a little. I could launch into a long discourse on Twitter, but I think I'll be like Lincoln and end this just a little bit early and have pity on you. We've got a way to go with COVID. It's not over. Wearing a mask is a good idea when you're in situations you could think are dangerous. And remember that if you are in one of those vulnerable groups and you could get Paxlovid, the drug, it might just save your life. The Americans are talking about giving it to everyone who tests positive. And if we had drugs that would really knock off the virus, and we got another, because these drugs we're developing now for COVID will actually work against all the coronaviruses. They work against the replication mechanism. So the viruses that work against influenza work against all the influenza viruses. We could also make them against the filoviruses, the Ebola type virus, the henipaviruses, the ones that call Hendra and Nipah virus infections. All of these are potential pathogens that are sitting in bats. Bats seem to have a different sort of immune system from us that allows them to have a lot of these infections that are quite chronic. And so they're a major source of potential pathogens. Now, we don't want to go around the world and kill all the bats. They're very important species. They do a lot for the environment and in nature. But there's a constant threat out there. But if we had these drugs, we could potentially handle this. So it looks like chemistry may be the way to handle the situation. So there I will finish. I'm not, so, thank you.
Oh, you can stay up here. I'm going to embarrass you a little bit. Good evening. I'm David Lloyd. I'm the Vice-Chancellor and President of UniSA. And it falls to me to thank you, Peter, for allowing us a glimpse into the global scientific culture that studies and measures and then hypothecates and confronts a political culture that says, no, we've got a better idea. Or at least for promising to do that, but then delivering a completely different lecture, but equally brilliant here tonight. If you want to go online and download a transcript of what Pete said he was going to say, I do challenge you to compare it to the what was delivered here tonight, the tour de force. I should also at this stage confess that I am a chemist, so I'm glad to hear that chemistry is going to save us all. I'd say that puts the pecking order of chemistry, astrophysics, biochemistry.
It's the way they line up the Nobel Prize winners. This, Nobel himself worked it out. Physics is first because they're the smartest people in the universe. I mean, check with your local physicist, they'll tell you. Chemistry comes next, then there's medicine, very much lower down the pecking order, basically. And then it's literature. Then there's economics, but it's not the Nobel Prize for economics. It's the Swedish Bank's Prize for economics in the name of Alfred Nobel. The Swedish banks bought their way into the prize. And we're very glad they did because the value of the prize increased enormously. And so, yeah. Chemist for number two.
Number two, I'll settle for number two. Thank you for your efforts to to discredit Donald Trump and the Nobel Committee.
I think Donald Trump needs to discredit him.
But also for managing to link that tonight to tracing the lineage of discovery from the Braggs through to the 1962 Nobel Prize and then to your own in 96 and to the pandemic today. There's absolutely little wonder that you are the most popular Nobel Prize winner on Twitter, because everyone knows that the Twitter sphere loves a born comedian. Never kiss a camel. It can lead to Contagion, which was a reasonably good movie, but regrettably the reality was slightly more terrible than fiction. But in this version of the movie, the good guys are winning the battle, if not the war. For more than in little more than 2 years, we've managed to deliver 11.8 billion doses of vaccines to the global population. That's 5 billion people fully vaccinated, or at least on the way to fully vaccinated, if such a fully vaccinated thing exists. But we still have a way to go, so that everyone can slowly, as we have, come out of the isolated state that we were in for the last couple of years, and can live with COVID in the realm of antiviral drug development, a renaissance of chemistry. Glaxo will have to rehire their chemists.
There just aren't enough chemists. Yeah. And if there are any young people out there, go and be chemists, because
it's a career path really, to vice chancellorship.
Chemists are the
I'm sure that we also all owe our eternal gratitude, not just to those in laboratories, but also the frontline workers who, for 2 years, in much the same way as in when HIV and AIDS came out, stood in the face of unknown fear and delivered to the people. I think that we can go on and enjoy our life as we know it, but we should be more aware that while a pandemic might not end us, our own meddling in the mechanics of the climate could, and we should take that home as well tonight. I hope that many of you will enjoy reading Peter's book. You may win a Nobel Prize as a result. Wrong book, sorry, wrong book. An Insider's Plague Year is a chronicle of the biggest challenge to confront us in living memory, and let us hope that we never come this close to catastrophe again. And I ask you now to join with me to formally thank Peter wholeheartedly for giving us an insider's look here tonight. Peter. You're off the hook. Yeah. I first met Peter in Ireland about 12 years ago, and I laughed as much then as I did here tonight. I would like to thank the Hawke Centre's Executive Director, Jacinta Thompson, and her team for bringing us the event tonight, because as you may have realised, we have tried to do this on more than a couple of occasions so far, and every time it became a little bit too risky to deliver. So Jacinta's team have had to organise and reorganise and disorganise, and while it doesn't come as close as to developing vaccines, they did put in an awful lot of work to organise an event like this tonight, which does come with its own challenges. So thank you, Jacinta, and to all the folks behind the scenes. Before we close, though, I would like to just say a premature, very happy 98th birthday to Sir Eric Neil, who celebrates his birthday tomorrow. As he said to me earlier on, I'm entering my 99th year in the morning. And then Blanche said, the secret to living to 99 is to live to 98. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. Have a safe trip home, and we look forward to seeing you again at a future Hawke Centre event. Good night.